Evidence by design or evidence architecture is needed for claiming therapeutic equivalence of pharmaceuticals in the real world of this 21st century. Good day to all in the audience. I am Ejaz Hussain, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to share some thoughts on this topic with you. In this presentation, I seek to direct my thoughts on issues that frustrate us in our daily routine, namely multiple review cycles, delays in approvals, product recalls, and CGMP enforcement actions. Why do these challenges occur? How these impact therapeutic equivalence? What can we do to minimize these challenges? Let us begin with the end in mind. Our discussion on evidence architecture is to find the portfolio of adequate and well-controlled investigations that allow us to claim therapeutic equivalence in a generic context where automatic substitution is allowed, and pharmaceutical equivalence when necessary bioequivalence, label, and CGMP are the four components when integrated appropriately provide the evidence of therapeutic equivalence. Also, therapeutic equivalence in the context of 505(b)(2) applications where pharmaceutical alternates are involved. And therapeutic equivalence is in the mind of the prescribing physician and not necessarily of the same meaning as in the Orange Book. Here, automatic substitutions are not allowed. In 505(b)(2) applications, evidence must provide full investigations of safety and effectiveness, where at least some of the information required for approval comes from studies not conducted by or for the applicant and for which the applicant has not obtained a right of reference or use. For example, agencies' finding of safety and or effectiveness for a listed drug or published literature. The 21st Century Cures Act of 2016 seeks to create a tipping point to usher in personalized medicine, patient-centric drug development, and demands FDA to utilize a real-world evidence in its decision-making process. In this context, it is important to recognize the meaning of adequate and well-controlled investigations, including clinical investigations in our Food and Drug FD&C Act. As we have observed over the years for generics and for biosimilars, the criteria for evidence has shifted from a pivotal clinical trial or a pivotal biostudy to weight of evidence and totality of evidence. As we usher into thinking about therapeutic equivalence in a legal sense for generic in the real world, and in therapeutic equivalence in the context of a physician prescribability for a 505(b)(2) application, the key question then is what are the weight of evidence or totality of evidence, and how do we shift the mindset of experts from the notion of what is pivotal to an integrated concept of evidence, where adequate and well-controlled studies can be in vitro, can be biochemical assays, can be a multitude of adequate and well-controlled investigations, and not necessarily putting the weight of evidence on a pivotal clinical trial. The key reminder in the FD&C Act is adequate and well-controlled investigations are judged by experts qualified by scientific training and experience. And this is an aspect which evidence architecture, evidence by design thinking becomes necessary. This symposium focuses on finding ways and means to mitigate challenges in the clinical development stage of a abbreviated new drug application and 5052 development programs. So, weight of and totality of evidence for the real world is an important topic to think about. Let's remember from the FDA&C Act, the requirement is experts qualified by scientific training and experience can fairly and responsibly conclude that drug will have the effect it purports or is represented to have under the conditions of use prescribed, real world, recommended or suggested in the labeling or proposed labeling thereof. So the real world concept has, if you think carefully, was already built in under the conditions of use prescribed, how the patient feels and experiences a product, and that relates to automatic substitution and user experience. So those are the set of experiments that are becoming important. At the same time, given the weight of evidence and totality of evidence, and not thinking about pivotal clinical trial or pivotal biostudy, the clinical or biostudies are really have to be designed differently to address residual uncertainty that remains after we have conducted our adequate and well-controlled investigations in vitro in terms of product characterization, comparability, and other aspects. So the design of clinical study is different in these applications. It is not to reestablish safety and efficacy. That has already been done. It is to address residual uncertainty. And many times that mindset is absent. And the evidence architecture demands us to think about failure modes and residual uncertainties after the in vitro or non-clinical investigations have been conducted to establish equivalence. And the clinical or pivotal biostudies, the old mentality has to go away, and the clinical investigations and pharmacokinetic investigation or PKPD investigations have to address residual uncertainties and have to be designed for that purpose. The first 505(b)(2) approval of a follow-on biotech protein was for human growth hormone by Sandoz Omnitrope. The evidence architecture here emerged as comparability plus a clinical study to justify approval of all indications, not just the indications upon which the clinical trial was done. This was the early years of biosimilar discussions and debate before the current system was established. It took years of development, years of review, and a lawsuit for FDA to make a decision. Very costly, very delayed approval process. First generic of Lovenox required Sandoz to create or recreate new prior knowledge about the characterization aspects of this product. It became the basis for approval of this complex product as a generic, whereas in Europe it remained in the biosimilar category. More recently, as a consultant to Apotex, I had the opportunity to formulate and advise on their dispute of a 8-year long review process for their version of generic Nasonex. My experience in the tobacco sector working for Philip Morris was to think about an evidence architecture to establish equivalence where we didn't have a reference product. Modified risk tobacco product allows for a claim of tobacco harm reduction. What evidence can be generated to provide evidence of tobacco harm reduction, not only in terms of demonstrating risk reduction in terms of cardiovascular, COPD, and cancer risk, but also in the context of population risk. What happens when you introduce this product in the market? Would non-smokers start getting addicted to nicotine? Would ex-former smokers come back to smoking? All these aspects had to be integrated in a way that would be meaningful and practical in the context of getting an FDA approval. These are some of the influential cases in my experience base. And in all of those cases, the delay, the escalation of cost, the multiple review cycles uh, could have been better avoided by the notion of evidence architecture. In those cases, I was working to develop that evidence architecture in real time. Now we have an opportunity to learn from similar cases, to be proactive in creating our evidence architecture before we embark on a costly development program, and to build consensus with the FDA prior to launching this program. This is something very important for you to consider. Fair and responsible assessment and conclusion of adequacy of a weight or totality of evidence package is the biggest challenge today. I see this challenge across a number of different problems in helping companies resolve their complete response letters, in helping R&D teams develop their evidence architecture for chemically derived and biotech derived generics, follow-on and biosimilar products, and even in helping companies think about the evidence to justify uh, most relevant means to move from batch to continuous manufacturing. Why is that? Our education has predominantly been systematic or reductionist, disciplinary. We struggle to integrate across discipline. Multidisciplinary systems thinking is not a formal part of our education and training. And this is a gap that needs to be filled, which I focus on myself and along with my colleagues at NIPTI. Multiple review cycles, delays, recalls, CGMP enforcement actions. Why do these challenges occur? Here is a summary listing of what I have been discussing with you so far. Legacy challenges, mindset on pivotal trials, struggle in building consensus on waiting for weight of evidence, suboptimal development plans, the drivers, the old drivers, time to clinic, time to bio drives project managers at the expense of um, attention to all parts of the evidence. US FDA, under the new Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, is now beginning to build an integrative review. Long way to go. Office of Generic Drugs and Office of Pharmaceutical Quality still have gaps to fill. lacking expertise in certain disciplines within FDA for assessment, and the old mindset of pivotal bio, pivotal clinical still remains. The challenge what we face is our formal education and training does not address these aspects, and we have to learn from experience. Experiential learning takes time and opportunity to experience, and few have that opportunity. So, slow maturing of integrated design and systems thinking prevails, and we need to work on that. How we know what we know is very important contributor to the meaning we make, and humans are makers of their own meaning. In this discussion, we have used therapeutic equivalence to mean as described or defined in the Orange Book, but also broadly in the context of what does therapeutic equivalence mean to patients and to the care providers, especially in the context of 505(b)(2) applications where automatic substitution is not allowed, and prescribability of physician is to take advantage of certain features in your 505(b)(2) product and to achieve the same therapeutic equivalence for the patient that they're treating. So, how public perceives and values pharmaceutical quality is an open question today. Very recently, a week or two ago, FDA conducted a whole program on this aspect in the context of generic drugs. Multiple review cycles, in my experience, often distract attention away from what gives assurance. For example, the Apotex first generic Nasonex took 8 years. It centered around just the question of having to repeat the clinical study and the whole issue of polymorphism and particle size. And that debate, did it add value or did it take away from the assurance of quality that patients need? Recall CGMP enforcement actions such as warning letters, import alerts in the world of social media create so much negative messages that they erode assurance. Assurance of quality and of therapeutic equivalence is critical to real world therapeutic outcomes. Now, several studies have demonstrated that even the color and shape of tablet, when it changes upon automatic substitution, the adherence rates are going down. We have to remember we are in a personalized experience economy. Remember, the word experience means as a noun, practical contact with things in the real world. But experience as a verb is to feel. Our feelings matter more today than ever before. In fact, in certain segments of the populations, how we feel is more important than the real product. We are in the real world evidence context. We are in the big data, AI, and social media. We are moving towards outcome-based reimbursement in healthcare and the pharma sector value-based pricing. The interaction between outcome-based reimbursement and value-based pricing opens up new questions, especially in the negotiating on contracts. Assurance of quality and reliability of supply has become a big issue. Remember, now we are in the midst of a pandemic, and supply chain disruptions and other aspects are going to factor in more and more and more. Who makes the medicine I take is a pivotal question today. We must deliver assurance of therapeutic equivalence that overcomes all of these challenges. So, how evidence architecture impacts therapeutic equivalence has to consider all aspects from the perspective of the patient, the care provider, and from regulatory acceptance to what is the right thing to do. Evidence architecture cannot just focus on getting the approval from FDA. It must also consider the failure modes that relate to external quality failures. For decades, we have struggled to meet the needs and expectations of our stakeholders. Today, we continue to make mistakes. These are recurring errors. The rate of our external quality failures is high and poses a risk to patients, and it is eroding trust patients and their providers must have in the system. Placebo and nocebo effects are expectancy effects that we as a community of pharmaceutical knowledge have been aware of for decades, or for in the case of placebo effects for over 100 years. We design our clinical trials um, to account for these effects, such as controls such as double blinding, placebo arms are used in our clinical trials. These don't exist, or these are not practical controls in the real world use of pharmaceuticals. Therefore, expectancy effects have to be considered in developing our evidence architecture. Nocebo matters in the real world, and there are so many examples accumulating now that quality assurance and assurance of therapeutic equivalence is pivotal, and we cannot discount or disregard this aspect going forward. So let's summarize. What can we do to minimize these challenges? Let us remember, in the real world, therapeutic equivalence is an expectancy, and we have to manage not just risk and our knowledge, but expectancy management is a key. A therapeutic equivalence is a system of four parts in the generic context: pharmaceutical equivalence, when necessary bioequivalence, label, and CGMP. We have been focused on pivotal bio, and our laws, our regulations have also underscored pharmaceutical equivalence as exemplified by color and shape of tablet being important in the real world. So instead of looking at parts of the system, let's integrate pharmaceutical equivalence, when necessary bioequivalence, label, and CGMP. Now, extra attention is needed on the label for 505(b)(2) applications. Prescribability and switchability of 505(b)(2) application depends on what's in the label, and your evidence architecture has to bring that into considerations, because 505(b)(2) labels or package inserts are not the same as generics, and you have to design those labels too. The advantage of pivotal mindset, pivotal bio, pivotal clinical trial mindset, was that it led us to develop rigorous clinical and BE methodology, but at the expense of other methodologies that are needed for weight and totality of evidence. We need the pivotal mindset for all the parts of therapeutic equivalence, all the parts of the evidence we need, not just on clinical. And we have to improve the methodology for a weight of evidence and totality of evidence package. We have to recognize gaps in expertise. Maturity is needed for integration. And this maturity at the moment is highly variable because it is only coming from experiential learning, which requires opportunity to experience and it requires time. And this gap has to be filled by modifying our curriculum and the formal education and training. I think that's not necessarily the topic for today, but you have to recognize that and you have to assemble a team which has the right expertise. Project management plans and go no go gates have to ensure integration of all the pieces of evidence. It cannot be driven in the old way of uh, time to bio, time to clinical. That has to change. The regulatory submission, particularly CTDP2 section, has to be written to bring the reviewers along with you to show that how the evidence is integrating to 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 become the weight of evidence needed for therapeutic equivalence conclusion. But at the same time, I think it also needs to be addressing failure modes that relate to reliable manufacturing. One particular document that needs significant attention in writing is the quality overall summary. It is a key document. The the quality of the quality overall summary tells me or tells should tell everyone that yes, this is a integrated development, a systems oriented development that brings the weight of evidence to be justified. Do not underestimate the challenge. I still recall, um, while at Sandoz, I was the global head for biosimilar development, and other parts of Sandoz was investing in inhalation products, generic inhalation products. And although it was not in part of my portfolio, this failure is unfortunate, but it's predictable. I think initial design is the key because how patients feel upon switching when color and shape is influential for a tablet. Can you imagine for drug device combinations such as inhalation products, how pivotal that user experience is? And I think this is an example of an extreme example of the high cost of failure. But I think it is a useful reminder that initial design is the key. We are seeking equivalent effect in it purports or is represent to have under the conditions of use prescribed. And you have to think about user experience, particularly for drug device combinations, in a very significant way. And the lesson from the Tobacco Center of the ICOS is a useful. The ICOS application, as per FDA rules, is on the FDA website. So I would encourage you to look at the user experience learning that can be gauged from a consumer product sector, such as, and in the case of tobacco harm reduction, that's a useful example. Begin with the end in mind is one of the 7 habits that Stephen Covey has reminded us again and again. From a business perspective, end is first in and last out in the real world. First in and last out was the phrase that Sandoz had adopted when it was formed and when I was there at Sandoz. So I think that is a valuable phrase, first in and last out, but in the real world. Integrated development is transdisciplinary, not just multidisciplinary. You have to go transdisciplinary to think about the real world use. You have to design your regulatory communication prior to and in the applications. Remember to plan to acquire appropriate new prior knowledge. What is new prior knowledge? What is new prior knowledge? I don't have the time to define it for you today, but I leave with you a reference to a paper, an open access paper that you can download and review. I think it's an important paper, and it'll be eye opener. I wish you would do that. Let's remember to be patient centric. Today, the juxtaposition of the many and recurring contemporary challenges in the assurance of quality, the increasing mandates, opportunities, and duty of care to take responsibility to be more patient centric in what we do and to utilize real world evidence in our decision making demands evidence architecture. The notion of evidence architecture is not new. It was always present in our FD&C Act. It is generating evidence consisting of adequate and well-controlled investigations, including clinical investigations, by experts qualified by scientific training and experience. In the world of weight of evidence and totality of evidence, our qualification as a scientist has been reductionist. Let's not discount the challenges it poses. Let's build on our experiential learning to be able to integrate the pieces of evidence. New prior knowledge is important because after decades of RLD on the market, we still have to understand what the modes of failure and action are in many cases, and you have to generate that evidence to ensure that your products coming 20 years after, 10, 20 years after the RLD do not have the same failure modes. We have to focus on what can be accurately and precisely be measured when and where. Measurement system validity and uncertainty is pivotal to consider, especially for all the pieces of the evidence that have to come together and align and integrate. We have to justify the combination of the pieces of evidence that becomes totality of evidence in the context of therapeutic equivalence. Plus, we have to leverage the label, especially for 505(b)(2) application, and we have to assure CGMP compliance so that negative adverse regulatory outcomes such as warning letters and import alerts do not erode assurance of quality, because who makes the medicine I take is pivotal today. We have to, in our communications to regulators, demonstrate the benefit of the weight of evidence or totality of evidence versus the old way of doing things such as pivotal and bio approach. Demonstrate why this is superior. This is important for building consensus. And we must push to negotiate CMC biopharm specifications prior to clinical and bio study, whatever residual uncertainty that remains, because those studies can help to identify and conclude on what are the right specifications. Specifications for product quality control and product specifications should not be sent, should be set after the trial. They should be sent before the trials. These are some of the important aspects of evidence architecture, and I hope you found this presentation useful. I'll be connecting with you to answer your questions, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much for paying attention and giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. All the very best.